It was not the largest bombing campaign of World War II in Europe. It did not involve the most aircraft, nor did it have the most victims. Nevertheless, it still arouses the greatest passions. The bombing of Dresden in 1945, a completely destroyed historic city with tens of thousands of civilian victims. There are even words about a war crime. Others claim that it was a legitimate target during the war, when the enemy defended itself with all its might and by all means. So what actually happened? It is early February 1945. The war is drawing to a close. On the Eastern Front, the Third Reich is being badly pressed by the Red Army. They are only 100 kilometers from the Oder River to Berlin. At the Yalta Conference, where the three leaders of the Allied countries agree on the post-war structure of Europe, the Soviets have a seemingly small request for the Americans and the British. Our Soviet advance towards Berlin would be greatly helped if you started bombing the big key cities in the hinterland of the Eastern Front. For example, Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden. Dresden is a very beautiful city, a pearl of Baroque architecture. It is also known as Florence on the Elbe, the famous Semper Opera, Zwinger Palace, or the magnificent Frauenkirche, which is the dominant of the city. Normally, Dresden had about 600,000 inhabitants, but because of the advancing army, crowds of German refugees were heading here. In 1945, there were about 1 million people in the city. Local people say that the Allies will take into account such a beautiful city full of refugees. The current development indicates this. Dresden was until now the only large city to have a single bomb fall on it. But that is about to change soon. 1,000 kilometers away, bombs are being loaded into the Lancasters of the largest bombers of the time at British air bases. Most of the bombs weigh half a ton, but so-called block boosters were also being loaded. 2-ton monsters that alone can destroy an entire city block. The goal is not the refinery factory or other military facilities, and there are more than enough of them in the suburbs of Dresden. The goal is to destroy the city center, the transport and communication hub, the train station, and the offices of the Third Reich, to cause chaos and panic among the people. There are no doubts at all, consideration for civilians has long been lost in World War II. Now Dresden is on the agenda. 244 bombers of the first wave will fly over the city after 10 p.m. The Vanguard had previously illuminated the ground with flares on parachutes, which the Germans bitterly nickname Christmas trees. And then it all begins. German defense is almost non-existent. All Luftwaffe fighters are grounded because Germany is in a severe shortage of gasoline. And that's not all. The next day, 2 more waves of air raids arrive. A total of over 1,300 aircraft strike with tremendous force. It is interesting that on February 14th, Prague will also feel the power of Allied aircraft in blood. 62 American bombers deviate from their course due to a storm over Holland and continue over the Czech metropolis due to a navigation error. They see a city similar to Dresden split in half by a river, and in just 5 minutes, 150 tons of bombs will pelt the city. 701 people will die. But let's go back to Dresden. Here, a complete apocalypse occurred. Incendiary bombs set fire to the entire city center. A so-called firestorm arose in which the temperature reached 1,500 degrees Celsius. The smoke from the fire reached a height of 7 kilometers. This was impossible to survive. The asphalt was melting, and the shelters did not provide safety because the fire sucked all the oxygen out of them. It took 3 days to extinguish the city. Only then did the extent of the destruction become fully apparent. The entire city center was literally in ruins. Entire blocks, streets, neighborhoods. For 14 days, dead bodies were piled up on the main square. And by the end of the day, such a large pile had accumulated that it covered the entire square. Men, women, children. All the monuments were gone too. After 3 days, the Frauenkirche Church collapsed, the dominant landmark of Dresden, whose ruins will remain in place for decades as a memento of those February days of 1945. The story of the air raid on Dresden eventually became a myth. Nazi propaganda first claimed responsibility for the attack. It calculated the number of victims at an incredible 250,000, and they would have liked to have Churchill and Roosevelt brought before a war tribunal for crimes against humanity. Later, the communists didn't do much either, and according to them, the ruins of the city were proof of barbaric imperialism. There was still speculation about the number of victims, until after the reunification of Germany, the Dresden Historians Commission issued a final account. According to it, at least 18,000 to 25,000 people did not survive the raid. Thanks for watching. See you next time.